Socrates is indisputably one of the greatest philosophers of all time, and he has always been that way, primarily because of his contribution to the field of philosophy itself, and he was also the father of the subject, because no one before him could actually bring about something called philosophy into existence. He was the first one to question everything about life itself, and that included himself as well as the other people around him in the society of Athens, Greece, where he was born. So Socrates primarily believed in self-criticism, self-knowledge, and self-consciousness, because when one criticizes oneself, including one's behavior, action, perception, and ways of thinking and approaching things, then one is actually able to improve himself in real time, and is also able to make real progress and improvement upon himself. And that's why we must always be willing to question ourselves under all circumstances and situations, however much successful, powerful, or wealthy we may be in our individual lives. Despite our success, power, wealth, or riches, when we question ourselves, when we interrogate our behavior, perception, and outlook, then we are able to deal with our insecurities, remove our biases, and obviously are able to also rectify and deal with our problematic perception and outlook in one way or another. But if we don't interrogate or question ourselves regarding anything, then we don't improve and continue with the same arrogance, ignorance, and pride that we have always been doing. And that makes Socrates one of the greatest figures in the history of the world and in the history of philosophy itself. So Socrates was actually born in the year 469 BCE, and he lived to the year 399 BCE. And Socrates is one of the few individuals whom one could say has so shaped the cultural and intellectual development of the world that without him, history would be profoundly different. He is best known for his association with the Socratic method of question and answer, his claim that he was ignorant or aware of his absence of knowledge, and his claim that the unexamined life is not worth living for human beings. He was the inspiration for Plato, another great, influential, and prominent philosopher who made philosophy and politics important, significant, and influential to the modern period and people. He was also widely held to be the founder of the Western philosophical tradition. Plato in turn served as the teacher of Aristotle, thus establishing the famous triad of ancient philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Unlike other philosophers of his time and ours, Socrates never wrote anything down but was committed to living simply and to interrogating the everyday views and popular opinions of those in his home city of Athens. Meaning, Socrates did not necessarily write anything down regarding his philosophy, wisdom, intelligence, or reasoning, but he did certainly lived in accordance with his own virtues, moralities, and values. Despite external criticism, societal pressures, governmental restrictions, prohibitions, and so on and so forth, Socrates was always able to, because he was always willing to live with honesty, integrity, morality, and character, and with the help of his self-created virtues and ideals, regardless of the circumstances or consequences he was in or that he faced for doing so. And he encouraged also the other people in society to interrogate themselves and question their behavior, action, perception at every step of the way so that they could improve. And he taught the same to us so that we can also improve and enhance ourselves in all aspects of our lives through self-interrogation and self-criticism. And at the age of 70, he was put to death at the hands of his fellow citizens on charges of impiety and corruption of the youth. His trial, along with the social and political context in which occurred, has warranted as much treatment from historians and classicists as his arguments and methods have from philosophers. So this was a brief account of Socrates himself and regarding his life, inspiration, philosophy, virtue, and his student Plato. Now we are going to discuss and analyze his key philosophies and his principal points. The first one being the Socratic problem, the philosophical Socrates. The Socratic problem is the problem faced by historians of philosophy when attempting to reconstruct the ideas of the original Socrates as distinct from his literary representations. While we know many of his historical details of Socrates' life and the circumstances surrounding his trial, Socrates' identity as a philosopher is much more difficult to establish because he wrote nothing. What we know of his ideas and methods comes to us mainly from his contemporaries and disciples. So one of the fundamental and key problems with Socrates himself and interpreting his works and philosophies is that he never actually wrote anything down regarding his philosophy, thought, concept, perception, etc. He lived with integrity, morality, and character. He lived and he acted in accordance with his principles and virtues, but he actually left no trace of his writings behind because he may not have written anything. And we can only get access to his writings and thoughts and perceptions through his disciples, with Plato being the main student. And this is a significant problem faced by historians and other literary analysts who attempted and tried to interpret Socrates and obviously explain his philosophies to the people of the contemporary world and obviously modern culture. So there were a number of Socrates' followers or students who wrote conversations in which he appears. These works are what are known as the Logoi Socratum or Socratic accounts. Aside from Plato and Xenophon, most of these dialogues have not survived. What we know of them comes to us from other sources. For example, very little survives from the dialogues of Antisthenes, whom Xenophon reports as one of Socrates' leading disciples. Indeed, from polemics written by the rhetor Isocrates, some scholars have concluded that he was the most prominent Socratic in Athens for the first decade following Socrates' death, and that is Antisthenes, one of Socrates' main students or disciples, but we actually cannot access him because of his inaccessibility. Diogenes of Sinope attributes to Antisthenes a number of views that we recognize as Socratic, including that virtue is sufficient for happiness, the wise man is self-sufficient, only the virtuous are noble, the virtuous are friends, and good things are morally fine, and bad things are base. Meaning, according to Diogenes of Sinope, or Diogenes the Cynic, we get an account of Antisthenes, who actually carried some semblance or trace of Socrates' writings and teachings about himself, in which we find that virtue is actually sufficient for the development and the achievement of happiness, peace, and content in one's life, and the wise man is always self-sufficient. Despite external difficulties, societal pressures, and governmental obstacles, the wise man will always be self-sufficient, and he will need or desire nothing because of his own internal feeling of sufficiency and virtue. And only the virtuous are noble, the virtuous are friends, and good things are morally fine and bad things are base, meaning only those things that are regulated by and marked by virtue can be considered to be truly good and moral and ethical. And the virtuous men are friends, and good things are usually morally fine and bad things are always going to be base, average or mediocre in and of themselves, however much influential, prominent or significant they may be. But bad things can never become great, real, important or authentic in themselves because of lack of virtue and morality. So now we discuss origin of the Socratic problem, which is the second point in our discussion. The Socratic problem first became pronounced in the early 19th century with the influential work of Friedrich Schleiermacher. Until this point, scholars had largely turned to Xenophon to identify what the historical Socrates thought. Schleiermacher argued that Xenophon was not a philosopher but rather a simple citizen soldier, and that is, Socrates was so dull and philosophically uninteresting that reading Xenophon alone it would be difficult to understand the reputation accorded Socrates by so many of his contemporaries and nearly all the schools of philosophy that followed him. The better portrait of Socrates, Schleiermacher claimed, comes to us from Plato, meaning Plato has always been considered indisputably the greatest student, disciple and follower of Aristotle himself. No one has ever been able to interpret Socrates in a better or in a clearer manner than Plato has, and that means Plato was indeed the greatest student of Socrates of all time. And we get several accounts on the philosophy of Socrates from Diogenes to actually Antisthenes to Xenophon, but none of them can be considered to be trustworthy or even deserving of much attention, importance or honor because of their lack of the clarity and depth and significance of Socratic philosophy and the character that Socrates carried about himself. So we have to read Plato. Though many scholars have since jettisoned Xenophon as a legitimate source for representing the philosophical views of the historical Socrates, they remain divided over the reliability of the other three sources. For one thing, Aristophanes was a comic playwright and therefore took considerable poetic license when scripting his characters. Aristotle, born 15 years after Socrates' death, hears about Socrates primarily from Plato. Plato himself wrote dialogues or philosophical dramas, and thus cannot be understood to be presenting his readers with exact replicas or transcriptions of conversations that Socrates actually had. Furthermore, many scholars think that Plato's so-called middle and late dialogues do not present the views of the historical Socrates, meaning it is considerably difficult for us to get access to the historical Socrates because no one actually is able to properly represent Socrates because of his own unavailability of writings, and also the fact that Socrates did not write anything down by himself. He solely and simply lived in accordance with his own virtues and self-created ideals and honor and honesty. But even Plato could not represent Socrates in the historical sense and in the appropriate manner because Socrates was inaccessible because of his own lack of writings, and Plato himself wrote only dialogues and philosophical dramas in which he presents Socrates as one of the main or major characters. And in that sense, it becomes difficult and almost impossible for us to understand Socrates in its originality and in its entirety, because Plato's philosophical dramas do not properly represent even the replicas or transcriptions of the conversations that Socrates actually had with the people of the Athenian society. And furthermore, many scholars have already argued that Plato's so-called middle and late dialogues do not present the views of the original historical Socrates. We therefore see the difficult nature of the Socratic problem, because we don't seem to have any consistently reliable sources. Finding the true Socrates or the original Socrates proves to be an impossible task. What we are left with instead is a composite picture assembled from various literary and philosophical components that give us what we might think of as Socratic themes or motives. So Socrates is going to remain inaccessible for the foreseeable future, because all of his disciples, followers or students, from Aristophanes to Antisthenes to Xenophon to Plato, have not been able to portray or represent Socrates in the exact manner. So they lack originality. Their accounts of Socrates' explanation or representation is not really marked by, or it lacks originality, authenticity, and honesty, and cannot be taken for granted, therefore. But now we first try to understand the comic playwright and poet Aristophanes' account of Socrates. Aristophanes was born in 450 BC, and he wrote a number of comic plays intended to satirize and caricature many of his fellow Athenians. His Clouds was so instrumental in parodying Socrates and painting him as a dangerous intellectual capable of corrupting the entire city that Socrates felt compelled in his trial defense to allude to the bad reputation he acquired as a result of the play. Aristophanes was much closer in age to Socrates than Plato and Xenophon, and as such is the only one of our sources exposed to Socrates in his younger years, meaning Aristophanes was the only one who was as the similar age as Socrates himself, and that means he could actually properly describe Socrates, and better than Plato and Xenophon combined. In the play, Socrates is the head of a school of learning where students are taught the nature of the heavens and how to win court cases. Socrates appears in a swing high above the stage, purportedly to better study the heavens. His patron deities, the clouds, represent his interest in meteorology and may also symbolize the lofty nature of reasoning that may take either side of an argument. The main plot of the play centers on an indebted man called Strepsidas, whose son Pheidippides ends up in the school to learn how to help his father avoid paying off his debt. Aristophanes' Socrates is a kind of variegated caricature of trends and new ideas emerging in Athens that he believed were threatening to the society. We find a number of such themes prevalent in pre-Socratic philosophy and the teachings of the Sophists, who were professional teachers, including those about natural science, mathematics, social science, ethics, political philosophy, and the art of words. Meaning, Socrates was actually represented by Aristophanes in such a manner that it represented a proper threat and danger to the Athenian society itself as well as to its citizens and politics, because Socrates was always teaching something which was reasonable, intellectual, intelligent, and wise in nature, that threatened the different structures of the society and the apparatus of power itself. And that's why Socrates was eventually executed in a prison, whereby they made him drink the poisonous herb of hemlock, and he died as a result of that. But it is also true that Socrates was influencing or corrupting, at least according to the Athenian authorities, the youth and the young people, men and women, with his obviously thinking, perception, outlook, understanding. And the pre-Socratic philosophy also points to the dangers of authentic thinking and original perception and reasoning. The teachings of the sophists, who were professional teachers, and they taught almost everything. Amongst other things, Aristophanes was troubled by the displacement of the divine through scientific explanations of the world and the undermining of traditional morality and custom by explanations of cultural life that appealed to nature instead of the gods. Additionally, he was reticent about teaching skill in disputation for fear that a clever speaker could just as easily argue for the truth as argue against it. These issues constitute what is sometimes called the new learning developing in 5th century BCE Athens, for which the Aristophanic Socrates is the iconic symbol. Meaning, Aristophanes was actually able to portray Socrates in a manner that directly challenged the Athenian society itself, and obviously the different laws and orders of the politics of the time, and that's why he was executed as a consequence. And so now we talk about another student of Socrates, that is Xenophon. Xenophon's reputation as a source on the life of ideas of Socrates is one on which scholars do not always agree. Largely thought to be a significant source of information about Socrates before the 19th century, for most of the 20th century, Xenophon's ability to depict Socrates as a philosopher was largely called into question. Following Scaliger, many argued that Xenophon himself was either a bad philosopher who did not understand Socrates, or not a philosopher at all, more concerned with practical everyday matters like economics. However, recent scholarship has sought to challenge this interpretation, arguing that it assumes an understanding of philosophy as an exclusively speculative and critical endeavor that does not attend to the ancient conception of philosophy as a comprehensive way of life. Meaning, a modern philosophy has actually criticized Xenophon's depiction of Socrates because he was not able to portray the great philosopher Socrates in the appropriate manner because of lack of depth, significance, and importance in his own philosophy. And moreover, Xenophon was a military figure. He was a soldier. He was writing down theories that pertain to economics and to other views. And recent scholarship has challenged Xenophon for that, and underlines the concern that his philosophy is exclusively speculative and critical endeavor that obviously does not attend to the, or neither does it fulfill the ancient conception of philosophy as a comprehensive way of life. So Xenophon has not been able to represent Socratic philosophy as a comprehensive and complete way of living and life itself, alongside honesty, loyalty, and morality towards oneself, and also the development and execution of rationality, reasoning, worth, wisdom, and intelligence. So his philosophy remains speculative, that is Xenophon's. While Plato will likely always remain the principal source on Socrates and Socratic themes, Xenophon's Socrates is distinct in philosophically interesting ways. Plato may be the most reliable philosopher when it comes to depicting, interpreting, and explaining Socrates to not only then people but also to the people of the modern society and modern culture and literature and philosophy. But Xenophon says Socrates is interesting also philosophically. So part of Socrates' freedom consists in his freedom from wants, precisely because he was mastered himself. So the Socratic freedom primarily concerns itself with freeing oneself from all desires and destroying need in itself. So Socrates could experience absolute freedom because he was able to free himself from worldly desires and liberate his mind from materialistic wants, objective pleasure, and satisfaction of all kinds, no matter the type or the kind or however important or significant it may be from the outside. But satisfaction, pursuit of pleasure, and satisfaction of desire actually can never lead to the development of virtue within oneself and to the subsequent achievement of happiness, peace, content, or prosperity in anyone's life under any circumstances and situations. So the Socratic freedom principally tells us and suggests us to remove desire and want from within ourselves entirely, so that we can achieve and experience real and authentic freedom, which is unaffected by desire, pleasure, or fulfillment. And Socrates' freedom lied in his ability to master himself. Socrates mastered his mind. He mastered desire, passion, and other sorts of obviously wants, as opposed to Plato's Socrates. Xenophon's Socrates is not poor, not because he has much, but because he needs little. So Plato depicted Socrates in a manner which represented his poverty. So Plato depicted Socrates as poor, but Xenophon's Socrates was rich and wealthy, not necessarily because Socrates or he actually had wealth or possessions, but because he desired none and he needed very little just to keep himself alive. So that's how Xenophon's Socrates works. Now we come down to the final analysis and depiction of Socrates, and it's from Plato himself, who is arguably considered to be one of the greatest philosophers of all time and also the most trustworthy and reliable student of Socrates himself. Plato was Socrates' most famous disciple, and the majority of what most people know about Socrates is known about Plato's Socrates. So what we know about Socrates today is actually because of Plato's depiction and representation of Socrates, which is sometimes taken and accepted as the historical one. Plato was born to one of the wealthiest and politically influential families in Athens in 427 BCE, the son of Ariston and Perictone. His brothers were Glaucon and Adamant, who were Socrates' principal interlocutors for the majority of the Republic. Though Socrates is not present in every Platonic dialogue, he is in the majority of them, often acting as the main interlocutor who drives the conversation. So in Plato's philosophical play or drama, The Republic, Socrates has been represented as the main interlocutor, or the person who communicates at every step of the way to every one of the other characters his wisdom, intelligence, reasoning, and knowledge, which help them become better in their real lives. The attempt to extract Socratic views from Plato's texts is itself a notoriously difficult problem, bound up with questions about the order in which Plato composed his dialogues. One's methodological approach to reading them, and whether or not Socrates or anyone else for that matter speaks for Plato. Meaning, the problem with understanding Plato's Socrates has always been prominent and is always there, because it's very difficult to extract from Plato's texts the philosopher and the historical version of Socrates himself, because it's very notoriously difficult to extract from novels or dramas a proper picture of Socrates and his philosophy. So that's the principal difficulty. And generally speaking, the predominant view of Plato's Socrates in the English-speaking world from the middle to the end of the 20th century was simply that he was Plato's mouthpiece. In other words, anything Socrates says in the dialogues is what Plato thought at the time he wrote the dialogue. So Plato's account of Socrates cannot be taken for granted because it's untrustworthy and it lacks depth, significance, and proper representation of the philosopher and the human being Socrates himself, because in the Republic Plato writes dialogues that reflect himself only through Socrates. So Socrates says the dialogues that Plato writes by himself with his own intelligence, and therefore Socrates' account of Plato cannot be trusted. It cannot be taken for granted either. This view, put forth by the famous Plato scholar Gregory Blastos, has been challenged in recent years, with some scholars arguing that Plato has no mouthpiece in the dialogues, while we can attribute to Plato certain doctrines that are consistent throughout his corpus. There is no reason to think that Socrates or any other speaker always and consistently espouses these doctrines. There are a number of complications with this interpretive thesis, and many of them obviously focus on the portrayal of Socrates himself. Though the Gorgias is an early dialogue, Socrates concludes the dialogue with a myth that some scholars attribute to a Pythagorean influence on Plato that he would not have had during Socrates' lifetime. Though the Parmenides is a middle dialogue, the younger Socrates speaks only at the beginning before Parmenides alone speaks for the remainder of the dialogue. Finally, while Plato's most famous work, The Republic, is a middle dialogue, some scholars make a distinction within the Republic itself. The first book, they argue, is Socrates, because in it we find Socrates refuting Thrasymachus' definition of justice while maintaining that he knows nothing about justice. The rest of the dialogue, they claim, with its emphasis on the division of the soul and the metaphysics of the forms, is Platonic. To discern a consistent Socrates in Plato is therefore a difficult task. Instead of speaking about chronology or composition, contemporary scholars searching for views that are likely to have been associated with the historical Socrates generally focus on a group of dialogues that are united by topical similarity. These Socratic dialogues feature Socrates as the principal speaker, challenging his interlocutor to elaborate on and critically examine his own views while typically not putting forth substantive claims of his own. So now we come down to the final chain link, who actually has some resemblance with Socrates himself, and one of the main fundamental and foundational philosophers of that time, that is Aristotle. Aristotle was born in 384 BC, 15 years after the death of Socrates. At the age of 80, he went to study at Plato's Academy and remained there for 20 years. Afterwards, he traveled throughout Asia and was invited by Philip II of Macedon to tutor his son Alexander. known to history as Alexander the Great. While Aristotle would never have had the chance to meet Socrates, we have in his writings an account of both Socrates as method and the topics about which he had conversations. Given the likelihood that Aristotle heard about Socrates from Plato and those at his academy, it is not surprising that most of what he says about Socrates follows the depiction of him in the Platonic dialogues. Aristotle related 4 concrete points about Socrates. The first is that Socrates asked questions without supplying an answer of his own because he claimed to know nothing. So Aristotle also put forward 4 concrete points about Socrates, the historical figure himself. And in the first point, Aristotle says that Socrates asked questions without having concrete answers to himself. So Socrates did not necessarily have any answers or solutions to the questions and the many interrogations that he was conducting or experimenting, because he himself claimed that he was in no position of any knowledge or wisdom. He claimed that he did not know anything and that he was constantly searching for and acquiring knowledge from all his experiences and from everything that he encountered, faced, or underwent. And that's why Socrates was not in possession of knowledge, wisdom, or intelligence, even after being so wise, reasonable, rational, and intelligent in his time. But still he followed the principle and lived by the doctrine of ignorance, philosophical ignorance. And Socrates asked questions without supplying an answer of his own because he claimed to know nothing. The picture of Socrates here is consistent with that of Plato's Apology. Second, Aristotle claims that Socrates never asked questions about nature, but concerned himself only with ethical questions. Aristotle thus attributes to the historical Socrates both the method and topics we find in Plato's Socratic dialogues. So the second point which Aristotle attributes to Plato is that the second point that Aristotle attributes to Socrates is that Socrates never asked questions about nature, the natural world, or its elements, but rather he constantly interrogated himself, and he obviously wanted to live with ethics, morality, integrity, and character under all circumstances and situations, because his ultimate competition was his own internal self and his ego. And if he could constantly overcome that, he could constantly be in the process of becoming. And that was his goal, to constantly overcome the will, deal with ignorance, insecurity, and ego, and obviously acquire as much knowledge as he possibly could. And that is what he inspired also others to do. So this account of Aristotle's is actually consistent with Plato's depiction of Socrates, not only in the Republic but also in Apology. Third, Aristotle claims that Socrates is the first to have employed epigogy, a word typically rendered in English as induction. This translation, however, is misleading, lest we impute to Socrates a preference for inductive reasoning as opposed to deductive reasoning. The term better indicates that Socrates was fond or arguing via the use of analogy. For instance, just as a doctor does not practice medicine for himself, but for the best interest of his patient, so the ruler in the city takes no account of his own personal profit, but is rather interested in caring for his citizens. Meaning, Socrates actually was always asking questions to other people, even though he did not have answers to everything that he questioned or interrogated to others. But he was like the doctors who are always willing to treat other people but not apply their own medications on themselves. So Socrates was trying to make everyone good and even better with his own questioning and interrogative nature, and with his philosophies, wisdom, intelligence, critical thinking, which he believed God gave him the power to enlighten and illuminate the citizens and the people around him who seemed ignorant, arrogant, and lacked depth, dignity, significance, knowledge, information, and so on and so forth. And that's why Socrates actually took it upon himself to educate everyone by making them think about themselves and obviously contemplate upon their actions, behavior, conduct, perception, etc., so that they could question themselves, rectify their emotions, remove their erroneous behavior and faulty actions, and could actually become better and virtuous and moral and real time, and obviously so that they could live with honesty, loyalty, and understanding, not only towards themselves but also everyone in society. And that's how we create a harmonious, a good and a moral state or society or country, whatever you want to call it. So that's how Socrates comes into being, through the different philosophers, playwrights, and poets and literary figures that we try to discuss. And